deep beneath the cobblestone streets of Vatican City, behind doors that have remained sealed for centuries, lies a collection so vast and so dangerous that only a handful of people alive today have ever glimpsed its true contents. We're talking about the Vatican Secret Archives, now officially called the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a labyrinth of knowledge that stretches across 53 miles of shelving, containing documents that could rewrite everything we think we know about history, religion, and power. But here's what they don't want you to realize. This isn't just about dusty old manuscripts gathering cobwebs in forgotten corners. We're talking about active suppression of information that continues to this day, files that disappear without explanation, researchers who are denied access for reasons that make no sense, and documents that, if revealed, would shake the very foundations of one of the world's most powerful institutions. Tonight, we're going behind those locked doors. We're going to explore what happens when an organization claims to serve God while simultaneously controlling the flow of truth itself. And I have to warn you, once you see how deep this goes, you'll never look at the Vatican the same way again. I've spent the last 18 months investigating this story. I've spoken with former Vatican employees, historians who've been blacklisted from the archives, and researchers who've stumbled upon documents that were never meant to see the light of day. What I've uncovered isn't just a collection of secrets. It's a systematic pattern of information control that spans nearly 2,000 years. But before we dive into the darkest corners of these archives, you need to understand something crucial about how this system really works. Because the Vatican doesn't just hide information, they've mastered the art of hiding information in plain sight. Picture this. You're a world-renowned historian, and you've been granted the rare privilege of accessing the Vatican archives. You submit your request months in advance, undergo extensive background checks, and finally receive approval. You arrive in Vatican City, pass through multiple security checkpoints, and enter a reading room where natural light has been carefully controlled to prevent document damage. But here's the catch. You can only request 3 documents per day, 3 out of 85 kilometers of shelving. And you have to know exactly what you're looking for. There's no browsing allowed, no accidentally stumbling upon something unexpected. You must provide specific shelf numbers, exact document titles, and detailed justifications for why you need to see each item. Now imagine trying to research a complex historical event under these conditions. Let's say you want to understand the Vatican's role during World War II. You might spend months just figuring out which documents exist, assuming you can even find references to them in the limited catalogue available. By the time you've seen a fraction of the relevant materials, your research period expires, and you're back to square one. This isn't preservation, it's gatekeeping. And it's been perfected over centuries. But the real story begins with understanding what's actually in these archives. We're not just talking about papal correspondence or religious texts. These vaults contain intelligence reports from every major conflict of the last 1,000 years. They hold diplomatic cables that reveal secret alliances between the Church and world powers. There are financial records showing money flows that would make modern banking scandals look like pocket change. And then there are the files that nobody talks about, the ones that deal with what Vatican insiders call irregular phenomena. Documents that catalogue supernatural events, unexplained healings, and encounters that don't fit neatly into official church doctrine. These aren't fairy tales, they're detailed investigative reports, compiled by some of the most educated minds in history. One former Vatican employee, who spoke to me on condition of anonymity, described stumbling upon a file containing photographs and medical records from the 1952nd. The case involved a young girl in rural science. The file contained hundreds of pages of testimony from doctors in Italy who allegedly demonstrated abilities that couldn't be explained by conventional scientists and church officials. But when this employee tried to access the file again weeks later, it had vanished from the catalogue entirely. It was as if it never existed, they told me. But I had taken notes. I knew what I had seen. That's when I realized there are archives within the archives collections that exist but aren't officially acknowledged. This pattern repeats throughout modern Vatican history. Documents appear and disappear. Researchers are granted access to materials one day and denied the next. And when pressed for explanations, Vatican officials simply state that certain materials are not available for consultation at this time. But the real question isn't what they're hiding, it's why they're hiding it. And to understand that, we need to go back to the very beginning of the Vatican's relationship with information control. The Catholic Church has been in the business of managing information since its earliest days. In the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome, church leaders suddenly found themselves with unprecedented political power. But with that power came a problem. How do you maintain authority when people start asking uncomfortable questions? The solution was elegant in its simplicity. The church would become the sole interpreter of divine truth. They would decide which texts were sacred and which were heretical. They would control who had access to religious knowledge and under what conditions, and most importantly, they would preserve or destroy historical records based on whether those records supported or threatened church authority. This wasn't accidental, it was policy, and it shaped every decision about what information would survive and what would disappear into the void of forgotten history. Take the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where church leaders gathered to establish official Christian doctrine. The decisions made at this council didn't just shape religious belief, they determined which historical accounts would be preserved for future generations. Alternative versions of Christian history, different interpretations of Jesus' teachings, competing theological frameworks, all of these were systematically excluded from the official record. But here's what's truly remarkable. The Church didn't destroy these alternative accounts. They collected them, they studied them, and they locked them away in what would eventually become the Vatican secret archives. Why preserve what you're trying to suppress? Because knowledge is power, and the Vatican understood that controlling dangerous information was more valuable than simply destroying it. These documents became leverage ways to discredit opponents, blackmail rivals, or simply maintain an information advantage over secular authorities. This strategy proved incredibly effective. For over 1,000 years, the Vatican was essentially Europe's intelligence service. Kings and emperors might control armies, but the Church controlled information networks that stretched across continents. They knew about political plots before they happened, understood economic trends before they became apparent, and held secrets that could topple kingdoms. And they documented everything. Every confession heard by a priest, every private meeting between church officials and secular leaders, every rumor, scandal, and conspiracy that passed through their vast network of monasteries, parishes, and diplomatic missions. All of this information flowed back to Rome, where it was catalogued, cross-referenced, and stored in an ever-expanding archive system. By the Renaissance, the Vatican possessed what was arguably the most comprehensive intelligence database in human history. But maintaining this system required more than just collecting information. It required controlling who could access it. The Church developed increasingly sophisticated methods for restricting knowledge while maintaining the appearance of scholarly openness. They created bureaucratic mazes that exhausted researchers, imposed impossible requirements for document access, and used their political influence to discredit scholars who got too close to sensitive materials. This is where we start to see the blueprint for modern information control. The techniques developed by medieval church authorities are still being used today, refined and perfected over centuries of practice. Consider what happens when a researcher requests access to documents about the Crusades. They'll be given access to plenty of material chronicles of battles, records of financing, correspondence between religious and military leaders. But they won't see the intelligence reports that reveal how the Crusades were actually planned and coordinated. They won't find the documents showing how church leaders manipulated religious fervor to achieve political objectives. And they certainly won't discover the files that detail what really happened to the vast treasures looted during these campaigns. The information exists. It's sitting in those archives right now, but it's been carefully separated from the materials that researchers are allowed to see. This creates an illusion of transparency while maintaining complete control over the narrative. And this brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Vatican's information control system. They don't just hide their own secrets. They've become the final repository for secrets that other powerful institutions want to keep buried. Throughout history, failing empires, collapsed governments, and disgraced organizations have sent their most sensitive documents to the Vatican for safekeeping. Why? Because they knew these materials would be protected by the Church's legendary secrecy, and because they understood that the Vatican had both the motivation and the capability to keep dangerous information from ever seeing the light of day. This means that the Vatican archives don't just contain church secrets, they hold the buried histories of countless other institutions. Royal scandals, military atrocities, financial conspiracies, and political cover-ups from across Europe and beyond have all found their way into these vaults. But here's where the story gets even more complex. Because in recent decades, the Vatican's control over this information has begun to slip. New technologies have made document preservation and distribution easier than ever before. Freedom of information laws have forced greater transparency from other institutions, and a new generation of researchers has developed techniques for accessing restricted materials through legal and diplomatic channels. The result is that information the Vatican has kept hidden for centuries is starting to leak out, not through dramatic revelations or whistleblower scandals, but through a slow, steady drip of documents that paint an increasingly clear picture of how this system really works. And what that picture reveals is more shocking than most people could ever imagine, because we're not just talking about historical cover-ups or ancient scandals. We're talking about active, ongoing suppression of information that directly impacts the modern world. The documents that are surfacing tell a story that goes far beyond what most people understand about Vatican secrecy. We're talking about files that reveal how the Church has maintained influence over modern governments, shaped international conflicts, and manipulated global financial markets, all while presenting itself as a purely spiritual institution. Let me give you a specific example that demonstrates just how far this system extends into contemporary affairs. In 2019, a researcher studying Cold War diplomatic relations accidentally gained access to a misfiled document from the Vatican's modern archive. The document was a communication between Vatican officials and CIA operatives from 1963, discussing the coordination of information campaigns in Latin America. The contents were explosive. They revealed that the Vatican had been actively collaborating with American intelligence services to influence political outcomes in several South American countries. But here's the truly disturbing part: when the researcher tried to photograph the document for his records, Vatican security intervened. The document was immediately reclassified, and the researcher was banned from the archives permanently. But the damage was done. Word of the document's content spread through academic circles, confirming what many historians had long suspected. the Vatican's role as a neutral spiritual authority was largely a facade. Behind the scenes, they were active participants in global power politics, using their vast information networks to advance specific political agendas. This pattern of accidental discovery, followed by immediate suppression, happens more often than you might think. Vatican employees have reported finding documents that contradict official church positions, only to watch those materials disappear from the archives within days. Researchers have stumbled upon evidence of financial improprieties, political conspiracies, and cover-ups that would make front-page news around the world if anyone could access them long enough to document their contents. But the Vatican has learned from these mistakes. Modern security protocols are far more sophisticated than they were even a decade ago. Digital tracking systems monitor every document that's accessed. Researchers are subjected to increasingly invasive background checks, and the penalties for unauthorized disclosure have become severe enough to deter all but the most determined whistleblowers. Yet, despite these precautions, information continues to leak out. And what we're learning paints a picture of an institution that has operated as much more than a religious organization for centuries. The Vatican has functioned as a shadow government, an intelligence service, and a financial empire, all while maintaining the appearance of spiritual purity. Consider the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. For decades, this institution operated with virtually no oversight, handling financial transactions that would be illegal for any other bank in the world. Money laundering, tax evasion, funding of paramilitary groups, all of this was documented in internal Vatican records that have slowly made their way into public view. But the banking scandals are just the tip of the iceberg. Buried deeper in the archives are documents that reveal the Vatican's involvement in arms trafficking, political assassinations, and the systematic cover-up of war crimes. These aren't conspiracy theories, they're documented facts, recorded in the Church's own files. The problem is that accessing these documents requires navigating a system designed to prevent exactly that kind of discovery. The Vatican has perfected the art of burying explosive information in plain sight, mixing it with thousands of innocuous documents that researchers must wade through to find anything significant. And even when researchers do find something important, they face another obstacle: the Vatican's legal authority to suppress information they deem harmful to the Church's mission. This broadly worded restriction has been used to justify the suppression of everything from historical documents about medieval atrocities to modern evidence of financial corruption. But here's what the Vatican doesn't want you to understand. Their control over this information isn't just about protecting the Church's reputation. It's about maintaining a system of power that depends on information asymmetry. By controlling what people know about history, politics, and even scientific discoveries, the Vatican has preserved influence that extends far beyond the religious sphere. Take their approach to scientific information, for example. Most people know about the Galileo affair, where the Church suppressed astronomical discoveries that contradicted religious doctrine. But what fewer people realize is that this pattern of scientific suppression continued well into the modern era. The Vatican archives contain detailed reports about scientific discoveries that were deemed incompatible with Church teaching, and many of these discoveries were suppressed or discredited through the Church's extensive academic networks. We're talking about research into consciousness, studies of anomalous phenomena, investigations into the nature of time and space, all areas where scientific inquiry might challenge fundamental religious assumptions. The Vatican didn't just ignore this research. They actively worked to suppress it, using their influence in universities and research institutions to ensure that certain questions were never seriously investigated. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Vatican's information control system: They don't just suppress information that threatens the Church directly. They suppress information that might threaten the broader power structure that the Church is part of. Because here's what most people don't realize: the Vatican isn't an independent institution operating in isolation. It's part of a network of powerful organizations that have worked together for centuries to maintain control over global affairs. Banks, governments, intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, all of these institutions have found it useful to cooperate with the Vatican's information control system. Why? Because the Vatican offers something that no other institution can provide: the ability to make information disappear permanently. When a government falls or a corporation collapses, their secrets might eventually surface. But information that enters the Vatican archives can remain hidden for centuries, protected by religious doctrine and international law. This creates a perverse incentive structure where the most sensitive secrets from across the globe end up concentrated in a single location, controlled by an institution that answers to no earthly authority. The Vatican has become the ultimate safe deposit box for information that powerful people want to keep buried forever, and they've been remarkably successful at this role. Consider how many major historical events have aspects that remain mysterious or unexplained. Why do official accounts of certain wars, political assassinations, or financial crises contain obvious gaps or contradictions? In many cases, it's because the documents that would fill those gaps are sitting in Vatican vaults, classified indefinitely under religious privilege. But the system that has protected these secrets for centuries is beginning to break down. Digital technology has made document preservation and distribution easier than ever before. International law has evolved to limit religious institutions' ability to claim absolute secrecy, and public pressure for transparency has reached levels that would have been unthinkable in previous eras. The result is that information is starting to leak out faster than the Vatican can contain it, not through dramatic revelations, but through a steady accumulation of evidence that's allowing researchers to piece together a more complete picture of how this system really works. And what that institution that has operate picture reveals is, and far outside its stated mission for centuries, the Vatican hasn't just been preserving religious doctrine and spiritual guidance. It's been running what amounts to the world's oldest and most successful intelligence operation, collecting and controlling information that shapes global affairs to this day. The implications of this are staggering, because if the Vatican has been actively suppressing information for nearly 2,000 years, how much of what we think we know about history, science, and politics is actually true? How many discoveries have been buried? How many truths have been twisted beyond recognition? These aren't just academic questions. The information sitting in those archives could fundamentally change our understanding of human civilization. Medical knowledge that could save lives, historical truths that could resolve long-standing conflicts, scientific discoveries that could revolutionize our understanding of reality itself. All of this exists, documented and catalogued, but kept from the people who could benefit from it. And the Vatican shows no signs of voluntarily opening these archives. If anything, security has tightened in recent years as church leaders have recognized the threat that information disclosure poses to their continued authority. They understand that their power depends on maintaining control over the flow of information, and they're prepared to fight to preserve that control. But they're facing a losing battle against the tide of history. Information wants to be free, and the tools for preserving and sharing knowledge are becoming more powerful every day. The question isn't whether these secrets will eventually surface, it's what will happen when they do. Because when these documents finally do surface, they won't just challenge individual beliefs or institutional reputations. They'll force us to confront the possibility that everything we've been taught about the relationship between knowledge and power has been carefully orchestrated to serve interests we never fully understood. Let me tell you about Dr. Elena Marchetti, a Vatican researcher who worked in the archives for 15 years before her sudden dismissal in 2018. What she discovered in those final months of her employment would fundamentally change how we understand the Church's role in modern world events. Dr. Marchetti had been granted access to what's called the Contemporary Collection documents from 1939 onwards that are supposed to be gradually released as they reach certain age thresholds. But what she found wasn't gradual disclosure. It was selective editing on a massive scale. They weren't just withholding documents, she told me during our clandestine meeting in a Rome cafe. They were actively rewriting them. I found multiple versions of the same diplomatic cables, each telling a slightly different story. The versions that painted the Vatican in a favorable light were marked for eventual release. The others were marked for permanent retention. But the most shocking discovery came when Dr. Marchetti gained access to what Vatican insiders call the parallel archive. These are documents that were never supposed to be catalogued in the main system materials, so sensitive that they exist in a completely separate filing structure with their own security protocols and access restrictions. What she found there defied everything she thought she knew about the Vatican's operations. Financial records showing direct payments to paramilitary groups during the Balkan conflicts of the 1992nd. Intelligence briefings that revealed the Church's advanced knowledge of terrorist attacks that they never reported to authorities. Correspondence with pharmaceutical companies about suppressing medical research that conflicted with Church doctrine on reproduction and end-of-life issues. The scale of it was overwhelming, Dr. Marchetti explained. This wasn't just about protecting the Church's image. They were actively participating in shaping global events, then hiding the evidence of their involvement. But perhaps the most disturbing documents were those dealing with what Vatican officials termed anomalous phenomena. These weren't the carefully sanitized miracle investigations that occasionally make their way into public view. These were detailed scientific studies of events that challenged our understanding of physical reality itself. Dr. Marchetti described finding extensive documentation of cases that had been reported to Church authorities, but never investigated publicly. Individuals displaying abilities that couldn't be explained by conventional science. Physical phenomena that occurred in religious contexts, but were suppressed because they didn't fit established theological frameworks. Medical cases where conventional treatment had failed but unconventional approaches that the Church had studied extensively, had produced remarkable results. They had evidence of things that could revolutionize medicine, physics, our understanding of consciousness itself, she said. But instead of sharing this knowledge with the scientific community, they were hoarding it. They seemed more interested in controlling these phenomena than understanding them. The implications of what Dr. Marchetti discovered go far beyond Vatican secrecy. They suggest a systematic effort to control the development of human knowledge itself. By suppressing certain types of research and promoting others, the Church has helped shape the direction of scientific progress for centuries. Consider the field of consciousness research. While mainstream science has struggled to understand the nature of human consciousness, the Vatican archives contain detailed studies dating back hundreds of years documenting altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, and other phenomena that could provide crucial insights into how the mind actually works. But this research has been kept from the scientific community, classified under religious doctrine that treats such matters as purely spiritual rather than scientific. The result is that our understanding of consciousness has been artificially stunted, limited to approaches that don't threaten established religious frameworks. The same pattern appears in fields ranging from archaeology to astronomy. The Vatican has funded extensive research into ancient civilizations, alternative energy sources, and the nature of space and time. But the results of this research rarely make their way into public scientific discourse. Instead, they're buried in archives that researchers can't access, ensuring that certain questions remain unanswered. But Dr. Marchetti's discoveries didn't end with suppressed scientific research. She also found evidence of something far more contemporary and troubling: the Vatican's involvement in modern information warfare. Hidden among the diplomatic files were records of the Church's collaboration with intelligence agencies from multiple countries in what they called narrative management operations. These weren't just propaganda campaigns or public relations efforts. They were sophisticated psychological operations designed to influence public opinion on specific issues by controlling the flow of information through trusted channels. They had developed techniques for seeding information into academic institutions, news organizations, and social media platforms, Dr. Marchetti explained. The goal wasn't just to promote church positions, but to shape public discourse in ways that served broader institutional interests. The documents revealed that the Vatican had been working with government agencies and private organizations to suppress research into topics ranging from climate change to economic inequality. Not because the Church had official positions on these issues, but because certain findings might threaten the stability of systems that the Church benefited from. This goes far beyond traditional lobbying or advocacy work. We're talking about coordinated efforts to prevent certain information from reaching the public, regardless of its accuracy or potential benefit to society. The methods described in these documents are particularly sophisticated. Rather than simply suppressing unwanted information, the operations focused on flooding information channels with competing narratives that would confuse public understanding and prevent consensus from forming around inconvenient truths. For example, when research emerged suggesting that certain corporate practices were causing environmental damage, Vatican-affiliated organizations would simultaneously promote studies questioning the research methodology, fund alternative research that reached different conclusions, and support media campaigns that emphasized the uncertainty in the scientific community. The result wasn't that people believed false information instead of true information. The result was that people became so confused by conflicting claims that they stopped trying to understand the issue at all. And in that confusion, existing power structures remained unchallenged. But Dr. Marchetti's investigation didn't end with document discovery. She began trying to trace where this information was coming from and where it was going. What she found was a network that extended far beyond the Vatican itself. The Church wasn't operating in isolation. They were part of a consortium of institutions, banks, corporations, intelligence agencies, think tanks, and media organizations that shared information and coordinated activities to maintain what they called systemic stability. It wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense, Dr. Marchetti explained. There was no single controlling authority issuing orders. But there was clearly coordination, shared objectives, and a common understanding that certain types of information were too dangerous to allow into public discourse. The Vatican's role in this network was unique because of their access to historical information that other institutions lacked. They could provide context that helped predict how certain revelations might affect public opinion, and they had developed expertise in managing information disclosure over extremely long time periods. But they also served another crucial function. They provided moral legitimacy for activities that might otherwise be seen as unethical or illegal. When intelligence agencies wanted to suppress information, they could point to the Vatican's involvement as evidence that their actions served a higher purpose. This created a feedback loop where each institution's involvement justified the others. The Church could claim they were protecting spiritual values, while secular institutions could claim they were defending social stability. Meanwhile, information that might challenge any of these institutions remained safely buried. The sophistication of this system became clear when Dr. Marchetti tried to document what she had found. Every attempt to photograph documents was blocked by security systems she hadn't encountered before. Digital files she tried to access would mysteriously become corrupted. Even her handwritten notes were confiscated during routine security checks. They had anticipated that someone might eventually stumble upon this material, she realized. The security measures weren't just designed to prevent unauthorized access, they were designed to prevent anyone from proving that the material existed at all. But the Vatican had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that Dr. Marchetti would follow normal academic protocols and try to work within the system to address her concerns. Instead, she began developing her own methods for preserving and sharing information. Using techniques borrowed from investigative journalism and intelligence work, she started creating redundant records of everything she discovered. She developed coded systems for communicating with outside researchers, and she began building a network of Vatican employees who shared her concerns about information suppression. What she discovered was that she wasn't alone. Throughout the Vatican bureaucracy, there were people who had stumbled upon disturbing information and were struggling with how to respond. Some were historians who had found evidence of atrocities that contradicted official church positions. Others were scientists who had discovered research that could benefit humanity but was being suppressed for institutional reasons. These individuals had been isolated from each other, each thinking they were the only one who had concerns about the system. But when Dr. Marchetti began connecting them, they realized they were part of a much larger pattern of information control that extended throughout the institution. The result was the formation of what they called the Internal Archive, a shadow documentation system that preserved evidence of information suppression within the Vatican itself. This wasn't an official organization or a formal conspiracy. It was simply a group of employees who had decided that certain information was too important to remain hidden. But the Vatican's internal security apparatus was more sophisticated than they had anticipated. Within months of the Internal Archives formation, several key members found themselves transferred to positions where they no longer had access to sensitive materials. Others were encouraged to take early retirement or leave the church entirely. Dr. Marchetti herself was dismissed on charges of conduct incompatible with institutional values. The specific nature of her alleged misconduct was never explained, and she was required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented her from discussing her work publicly. But the damage had already been done. Information from the Internal Archive had begun making its way to researchers and journalists outside the Vatican, not through dramatic leaks or whistleblower revelations, but through carefully orchestrated campaigns that made it difficult to trace the information back to its sources. The result has been a slow but steady drip of revelations that are forcing people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Vatican's role in world affairs. Financial scandals that seemed isolated are revealed to be part of systematic corruption. Historical events that appeared to have simple explanations are shown to involve complex cover-ups. Scientific controversies that seem to be based on legitimate disagreements are exposed as manufactured conflicts designed to suppress inconvenient research. But perhaps the most significant impact has been on our understanding of how information control actually works in the modern world. The traditional model assumes that censorship involves obvious suppression, books being banned, websites being blocked, researchers being silenced. But what the Vatican documents reveal is a far more sophisticated approach that operates by shaping the information environment itself. Instead of preventing people from accessing information, these operations focus on ensuring that people can't make sense of the information they do access. Instead of silencing researchers, They fund competing research that reaches contradictory conclusions. Instead of hiding documents, they release carefully edited versions that tell incomplete stories. The result is a public that has access to enormous amounts of information, but lacks the ability to distinguish between what's true and what's been manufactured to serve institutional interests. And in that confusion, the real secrets remain hidden, not because people can't access them, but because people can't recognize them when they do. This represents a fundamental shift in how power operates in the information age. Traditional authority structures based on controlling access to information are giving way to systems based on controlling the interpretation of information. The Vatican has been at the forefront of developing these techniques, and their methods are now being adopted by institutions around the world. But there's a crucial vulnerability in this approach. It depends on maintaining public trust in the institutions that are shaping the information environment. And that trust is beginning to erode as more people recognize the patterns of manipulation and control. The documents emerging from the Vatican archives aren't just exposing church secrets, they're revealing the blueprint for information control systems that operate throughout modern society. Banks, corporations, governments, and media organizations all use variations of the same techniques that the Church has perfected over centuries. Understanding how these systems work is crucial for anyone who wants to navigate the modern information landscape effectively, because once you recognize the patterns, you start seeing them everywhere. The manufactured controversies, the coordinated confusion campaigns, the selective disclosure of information designed to support predetermined narratives, all of these techniques become visible once you know what to look for. And that recognition is the first step toward reclaiming our ability to distinguish between truth and manipulation in an age where the two have been deliberately intertwined. The Vatican's secrets matter not just because of what they reveal about church history, but because they illuminate the mechanisms of control that shape our understanding of reality itself. The question is, now that we can see these mechanisms at work, what are we going to do about it? Because the information is out there, waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to look beyond the carefully constructed narratives we've been taught to accept as truth. But Dr. Marchetti's story reveals an even more disturbing truth about how the Vatican's information control system has evolved in the digital age. Because what she discovered wasn't just historical suppression, it was real-time manipulation of information as it's being created. Hidden within the contemporary collection were detailed protocols for what Vatican officials called preemptive narrative management. These weren't reactions to inconvenient discoveries, they were strategies for preventing inconvenient discoveries from ever being made in the first place. The system works like this. Vatican intelligence networks monitor academic research, scientific studies, and investigative journalism around the world. When they identify projects that might threaten institutional interests, they don't wait for results to emerge. They intervene during the research process itself. Sometimes this intervention is subtle, funding competing studies that will muddy the waters, or ensuring that key researchers receive attractive job offers that pull them away from sensitive projects. Other times it's more direct equipment malfunctions that destroy months of work, computer viruses that corrupt datasets, or bureaucratic obstacles that make certain types of research impossible to complete. I found files documenting hundreds of these interventions, Dr. Marchetti explained. Research into ancient civilizations that might challenge biblical chronology, medical studies that could undermine church positions on bioethics, archaeological expeditions that were getting too close to sites the Vatican wanted to keep protected. They had developed an entire infrastructure for sabotaging inconvenient research before it could produce inconvenient results. But the most chilling aspect of this system is how it's expanded beyond protecting church interests. The Vatican has essentially become a service provider for information suppression, helping other powerful institutions manage their own inconvenient truths. Corporate scandals that never quite make it to trial because key evidence mysteriously disappears. Government corruption investigations that stall when crucial documents become inaccessible. Scientific research that could revolutionize entire industries but somehow never gets past the peer review process. In many of these cases, the Vatican's fingerprints can be found if you know where to look. They've turned information suppression into a form of diplomacy. Just as nations trade military support or economic assistance, the Vatican trades silence. They'll suppress research that threatens a pharmaceutical company's profits in exchange for that company's silence about Vatican financial irregularities. They'll bury archaeological evidence that challenges a government's historical narrative in exchange for that government's protection of church assets in disputed territories. This creates a web of mutual dependence where each institution's secrets protect all the others. No single organization could maintain this level of information control on its own, but working together, they've created a system that's nearly impenetrable, and they've learned to use the internet itself as a tool for information suppression. Rather than fighting digital technology, they've embraced it as the ultimate platform for manufacturing confusion. The documents Dr. Marchetti discovered included detailed strategies for what they called information dilution. Instead of trying to prevent people from accessing inconvenient facts, they flood information channels with so much contradictory material that people can't distinguish between truth and fiction. They've mastered the art of creating artificial controversies around established facts. Climate change, vaccine safety, historical atrocities. Issues where the scientific evidence is overwhelming become subjects of endless debate through carefully orchestrated disinformation campaigns that make the public believe there's genuine uncertainty among experts. The Vatican's role in these campaigns isn't always obvious. They rarely put their name on controversial content directly. Instead, they work through a network of front organizations, think tanks, and academic institutions that appear independent but are actually coordinating their activities. An environmental study that challenges corporate interests will suddenly face criticism from multiple sources that appear unrelated: a conservative think tank, a university research center, and a religious advocacy group. But if you trace the funding back far enough, you'll find connections to the same network of institutions that includes the Vatican. The result is that public discourse becomes impossible. People can't have rational conversations about important issues because they can't agree on basic facts, and in that confusion, the status quo remains unchallenged. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation in Dr. Marchetti's research concerned what the Vatican calls temporal information management, their strategies for controlling how historical events are remembered and interpreted across generations. This goes far beyond simply suppressing inconvenient documents. The Vatican has developed sophisticated techniques for gradually reshaping public memory of historical events, ensuring that even when information eventually becomes available, it's interpreted in ways that serve institutional interests. They've perfected the art of controlling historical narrative through selective disclosure. Documents are released not when they become historically significant, but when releasing them will support predetermined interpretations of events. For example, files about Vatican involvement in World War II aren't released randomly as they reach certain age thresholds. They're released strategically, with documents that make the Church look heroic being disclosed first, followed by more ambiguous materials that muddy the waters, and finally, by limited releases of compromising documents that are presented as exceptions rather than patterns. By the time researchers have access to the full picture, public opinion has already been shaped by decades of selective disclosure. The most damaging revelations are dismissed as old news, while the heroic narrative has become established fact in popular consciousness. This technique has been applied to virtually every controversial episode in church history: the Crusades, the Inquisition, colonial-era missionary activities, relationships with fascist governments in each case. The narrative has been carefully managed through strategic information release that spans decades or even centuries. But the system's sophistication becomes truly apparent when you realize that they're not just managing their own historical reputation, they're actively shaping how entire civilizations remember their past. Through their influence in educational institutions, museums, and cultural organizations, the Vatican has helped determine which historical events are emphasized and which are minimized in public education. Students learn about religious art and architecture, but not about the political and economic systems that made such monuments possible. They study individual historical figures, but not the institutional networks that shaped their actions. The result is a public that understands history as a series of disconnected events, rather than as the product of systematic power structures that continue to operate today. And that fragmented understanding makes it much harder for people to recognize those same power structures when they encounter them in contemporary contexts. Dr. Marchetti discovered that this historical manipulation isn't just about protecting the Church's reputation. It's about preserving entire ways of thinking about authority, power, and truth that serve institutional interests across society. By controlling how people understand the relationship between religious and secular authority in the past, the Vatican helps ensure that people don't question similar relationships in the present. By shaping public memory of how institutions have responded to crises historically, they influence expectations about how institutions should respond to contemporary challenges. This represents a form of psychological control that operates across generations. Children who grow up with carefully curated versions of history develop worldviews that make them more accepting of institutional authority and less likely to question official narratives about contemporary events. But the most shocking aspect of Dr. Marchetti's discoveries concerned the Vatican's research into what they termed consciousness management techniques for influencing human perception and decision-making that go far beyond conventional propaganda or persuasion. Hidden among the scientific documents were studies dating back centuries that explored the relationship between religious practices and alterations in human consciousness. These weren't theological investigations, they were systematic scientific studies of how specific rituals, architectural environments, and symbolic systems could influence human psychology and behavior. The research revealed that many traditional religious practices had been deliberately designed not just to inspire faith, but to create specific psychological states that made people more susceptible to institutional influence. Everything from the layout of churches to the timing of religious ceremonies had been optimized through centuries of experimentation to maximize psychological impact. But the Vatican hadn't stopped with traditional religious contexts. The documents showed that they had been studying how these same techniques could be applied in secular environments, corporate offices, government buildings, educational institutions, even shopping centers and entertainment venues. They had developed a science of environmental psychology that was centuries ahead of anything in mainstream academia, Dr. Marchetti explained. They understood how physical spaces, symbolic imagery, and social rituals could be used to influence human behavior on a subconscious level. This research had been shared with architects, urban planners, and interior designers who incorporated the findings into secular buildings without revealing the source of their knowledge. The result is that people are surrounded by environments specifically designed to promote compliance, reduce critical thinking, and encourage acceptance of authority, all while believing they're simply experiencing aesthetically pleasing or functionally efficient spaces. The implications of this research extend into virtually every aspect of modern life. the design of office buildings that promote worker productivity while discouraging union organizing, the layout of retail spaces that encourage impulse purchases while suppressing price comparison, the architecture of government buildings that inspire respect for authority while discouraging public protest. These aren't accidents or natural developments in design philosophy. They're the products of centuries of systematic research into human psychology, conducted by institutions that had both the resources to carry out long-term studies and the motivation to apply the results for social control. But Dr. Marchetti's investigation revealed something even more disturbing about how this research was being applied in the digital age. The Vatican had been working with technology companies to apply consciousness management techniques to digital interfaces and online environments. The documents showed collaboration with social media platforms, search engines, and content recommendation systems to optimize their psychological impact. The goal wasn't just to capture user attention or increase engagement, it was to create digital environments that would shape how people think about information itself. Users are exposed to information streams specifically designed to promote emotional rather than rational responses. Content is organized to prevent people from developing comprehensive understanding of complex issues. Recommendation algorithms are tuned to reinforce existing beliefs rather than challenging users with conflicting perspectives. The result is that people feel informed while actually becoming less capable of critical thinking. They have access to more information than ever before, but they're psychologically conditioned to process that information in ways that serve institutional interests rather than their own. This represents the culmination of centuries of research into information control. Instead of simply hiding inconvenient facts, these systems make people incapable of recognizing inconvenient facts, even when they encounter them directly. And the most disturbing aspect of this system is that it's self-reinforcing. The more effectively it shapes human consciousness, the less likely people are to recognize that their consciousness is being shaped. Users become convinced that their thoughts and opinions are their own, even when they're actually the products of sophisticated manipulation. Dr. Marchetti's research suggests that we're living through the most successful information control operation in human history, one that operates not by restricting access to information, but by controlling how human minds process information at the most fundamental level. The question that emerges from her discoveries isn't just what the Vatican is hiding, but whether we're still capable of recognizing truth when we encounter it. Because if our consciousness itself has been systematically modified to serve institutional interests, then even the most shocking revelations might not be enough to break us free from the systems of control that shape our reality. But there's a crucial weakness in this approach that Dr. Marchetti identified through her years of research. The system depends on people remaining unaware that their consciousness is being manipulated. Once individuals recognize the techniques being used against them, they can begin to develop resistance to those techniques. This is why the Vatican works so hard to suppress research into consciousness and psychology. It's why they've been involved in discrediting scientists who study human perception and decision-making. It's why they've fought to keep their own research into these areas classified. Because once people understand how their minds are being manipulated, they can begin to reclaim control over their own thoughts and perceptions. And that represents an existential threat to institutions that depend on information control for their continued authority. The documents that Dr. Marchetti preserved before her dismissal provide a roadmap for understanding these manipulation techniques. More importantly, they offer strategies for developing psychological immunity to institutional influence. But accessing this information requires going beyond the carefully curated narratives that surround us in everyday life. It requires developing the ability to recognize when we're being manipulated and the skills to seek out information that challenges our existing beliefs and assumptions. This isn't easy work. The systems of consciousness management that surround us are sophisticated and pervasive. They've been refined over centuries and optimized for maximum effectiveness. Fighting against them requires constant vigilance and a willingness to question everything we think we know about reality. But the alternative is to remain trapped in a carefully constructed illusion where our thoughts, emotions, and decisions serve the interests of institutions we never chose to empower. And for Dr. Marchetti, and for a growing number of people around the world, that alternative is no longer acceptable. The information exists. The techniques for recognizing manipulation are available. The tools for reclaiming psychological autonomy are within reach. The question is whether we have the courage to use them, even when doing so means confronting the possibility that everything we've been taught about reality might be fundamentally wrong. Because that's what the Vatican's secret archives ultimately reveal, not just specific historical cover-ups or contemporary conspiracies, but the systematic nature of information control itself. They show us how institutions shape human consciousness across generations, creating realities that serve their interests, while convincing people that those realities are natural and inevitable. But they also show us that no system of control is permanent. Information wants to be free, consciousness resists manipulation, and truth has a way of surfacing even when powerful institutions work for centuries to keep it buried. The question is whether we're ready to receive that truth when it finally emerges, and what we're prepared to do with it once we understand its implications. The story of Dr. Marchetti's dismissal might have ended there, buried under confidentiality agreements and institutional silence. But what the Vatican failed to anticipate was the network of support that had quietly formed around her work. Former researchers, dismissed employees, and Vatican insiders who had grown uncomfortable with what they witnessed began reaching out through encrypted channels and coded communications. What emerged was something unprecedented in the Church's history, a systematic effort by Vatican insiders to preserve and share the very information their institution was trying to suppress. They called themselves the Custodes Veritatis, the guardians of truth, though they rarely used that name in direct communication. These weren't radicals or disgruntled employees seeking revenge. They were scholars, archivists, and administrators who had devoted their lives to the Church but could no longer reconcile their faith with the institution's systematic suppression of truth. Many had discovered information that could benefit humanity: medical breakthroughs, historical insights, scientific discoveries, only to watch it disappear into the bureaucratic void. Dr. Alessandro Toretti, a former senior archivist who worked in the Vatican for 32 years before his quiet resignation in 2020, explained the moral crisis these individuals faced. "You enter this work believing you're serving God by preserving sacred knowledge," he told me during a carefully arranged meeting. "But gradually you realize you're actually preventing that knowledge from reaching the people who need it most." The custodes developed sophisticated methods for copying and preserving documents before they could be reclassified or destroyed. They created redundant storage systems scattered across multiple countries, ensuring that no single government or institution could suppress their growing collection of evidence. But perhaps, more importantly, they began developing techniques for verifying the authenticity of documents and tracing the connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. What they discovered was that the Vatican's suppression activities followed predictable patterns that could be mapped and analyzed. Once you understand the system, you can predict what they'll try to hide next, Dr. Toretti explained. They're not random in their choices. There's a clear logic to what threatens them and what doesn't. This predictive capability allowed the custodes to position themselves to preserve information before it disappeared. They developed early warning systems that identified research projects, archaeological discoveries, and scientific studies that were likely to face suppression. Then they worked to create independent records that would survive, even if the original sources were compromised. The results have been remarkable. Over the past 5 years, the custodies have preserved evidence of information suppression operations across dozens of countries and involving hundreds of institutions. They've documented the systematic burial of medical research, the suppression of archaeological discoveries, and the manipulation of historical records on a scale that defies comprehension. But their most significant achievement has been demonstrating that the Vatican's information control system isn't unique. It's part of a broader network of institutional cooperation that extends throughout modern society. Banks, corporations, governments, and media organizations all employ similar techniques, often in coordination with each other. The evidence suggests that we're living within what researchers now call the information control matrix, a vast system of interconnected institutions that collectively manage the flow of information to serve their shared interests. The Vatican isn't the center of this system, but it's one of the most important nodes, providing historical context and moral legitimacy for activities that might otherwise appear purely self-serving. This matrix operates through what specialists term distributed censorship. No single institution controls all information, but each controls specific domains that collectively cover virtually all aspects of human knowledge. Medical institutions control health information, educational institutions control historical knowledge, media organizations control news and analysis, and religious institutions control spiritual and moral frameworks. The result is that people can access enormous amounts of information within each domain, while remaining unaware of how those domains interact, or how information flows between them. Someone might be well informed about medical issues while remaining ignorant about the financial interests that shape medical research. They might understand historical events while missing the institutional continuities that connect past and present. This fragmentation of knowledge prevents people from developing comprehensive understanding of how power actually operates in modern society. And that fragmentation is deliberately maintained through carefully coordinated information management strategies that span multiple institutions and generations. The custodies' research has revealed that many of the major controversies and debates of our time aren't organic disagreements between competing ideas. They're manufactured conflicts designed to prevent consensus from forming around inconvenient truths. Climate change, economic inequality, public health policy, historical interpretation issues where clear evidence points in specific directions become subjects of endless debate through systematic information manipulation. The techniques are sophisticated and often invisible to those being manipulated. Genuine scientific uncertainty in narrow technical areas gets amplified into broad public confusion about well-established facts. Legitimate policy debates about implementation details get transformed into fundamental disagreements about basic reality. Complex issues that require nuanced understanding get reduced to simple partisan positions that prevent meaningful discussion. But the most insidious aspect of this system is how it turns people into unwitting participants in their own manipulation. Social media algorithms don't just show people information. They train people to seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs while avoiding information that challenges those beliefs. Search engines don't just provide answers, they shape the questions people think to ask. The result is that people feel informed and engaged while actually becoming more isolated from information that might change their perspectives. They develop strong opinions based on carefully curated information streams that give them the illusion of independent thinking while actually channeling their thoughts in predetermined directions. This creates what psychologists call false consciousness. People genuinely believe they're thinking for themselves while actually operating within constraints they don't recognize. And those constraints are continuously reinforced through environmental cues, social pressure, and information presentation techniques that have been refined over centuries. The Vatican's contribution to this system draws on their unparalleled expertise in managing human consciousness across long time periods. They understand how beliefs form, how they change, and how they can be shaped through subtle environmental influences that people don't consciously notice. This knowledge has been shared with secular institutions that apply it in contexts ranging from urban planning to product design to political campaigning. The goal isn't necessarily to promote specific outcomes, but to create populations that are psychologically predisposed to accept institutional authority and resist fundamental challenges to existing power structures. Dr. Maria Santos, a former Vatican psychologist who worked on what they called behavioral architecture projects, described how these techniques operate in practice. "We weren't trying to make people believe specific things," she explained. "We were trying to make them more comfortable with not knowing things, more willing to accept authority rather than seeking independent verification." The research focused on creating what they termed cognitive stability mental states, where people feel secure and confident even when they lack actual understanding of important issues. This stability is maintained through carefully designed information environments that provide emotional satisfaction while avoiding intellectual challenge. People are given enough information to feel informed, enough choice to feel autonomous, and enough complexity to feel sophisticated, while actually being guided toward predetermined conclusions through environmental cues they don't consciously recognize. The techniques work because they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology that most people aren't aware they possess. Humans are social creatures who instinctively seek approval from authority figures and conformity with group norms. They're also cognitive misers who prefer simple explanations to complex ones and familiar information to unfamiliar information. These natural tendencies can be leveraged through careful environmental design to shape behavior without people realizing they're being influenced. Office buildings that promote hierarchy through spatial organization, shopping centers that encourage impulse decisions through lighting and layout, educational institutions that reward compliance while discouraging critical questioning. The cumulative effect is that people live within constructed realities that feel natural and inevitable, while actually serving institutional interests they never consciously chose to support. And because these realities are constructed gradually over long periods, people adapt to them without recognizing that adaptation is occurring. But the system has a crucial vulnerability that the custodians have learned to exploit. It depends on people remaining unaware of how their consciousness is being shaped. Once individuals develop metacognitive awareness, the ability to think about their own thinking, they can begin to recognize and resist manipulation techniques. This is why the Vatican works so hard to suppress research into consciousness, psychology, and social influence. It's why they've been involved in discrediting educational approaches that emphasize critical thinking and media literacy. It's why they fight to keep their own research into these areas classified. Because once people understand how their minds are being manipulated, they can begin to reclaim cognitive autonomy. And that represents an existential threat to institutions that depend on information control for their continued authority. The documents preserved by the custodes provide detailed blueprints for developing this metacognitive awareness. They reveal the specific techniques being used to shape human consciousness, the environmental factors that influence decision-making, and the psychological vulnerabilities that institutions exploit to maintain control. More importantly, They offer practical strategies for developing immunity to these manipulation techniques. Methods for recognizing when information is being presented in ways designed to bypass critical thinking. Techniques for seeking out diverse perspectives on important issues. Practices for maintaining intellectual independence in environments designed to promote conformity. But accessing this knowledge requires going beyond the information sources that most people rely on in their daily lives. It requires developing the ability to recognize when we're being fed carefully curated narratives and the skills to seek out information that challenges our existing assumptions. This isn't comfortable work. The systems of consciousness management that surround us are designed to feel natural and supportive. Breaking free from them requires confronting the possibility that many of our most fundamental beliefs about reality might be products of systematic manipulation rather than independent reasoning. It also requires accepting responsibility for our own consciousness in ways that most people find overwhelming. It's easier to trust institutional authorities to tell us what's true than to develop the skills and knowledge necessary for independent judgment. It's more comfortable to accept pre-packaged worldviews than to construct our own understanding from primary sources and direct experience. But for the growing number of people who have glimpsed behind the curtain of institutional information control, comfort is no longer an option. They've seen how the system works, how it shapes human consciousness across generations, and how it prevents people from recognizing their own manipulation. They understand that reclaiming cognitive autonomy isn't just a personal challenge, it's a collective necessity for anyone who wants to live in a society based on truth rather than manufactured consent. And they're working to share the tools and knowledge necessary for others to begin that same journey of awakening. The information exists. The techniques are available. The choice is whether we have the courage to use them, even when doing so means abandoning the comfortable illusions that have shaped our understanding of reality since childhood. Because that's ultimately what the Vatican's secret archives reveal, not just specific institutional conspiracies, but the systematic nature of consciousness control itself. They show us how human awareness is shaped by forces we rarely recognize, how our thoughts and perceptions serve interests we never consciously chose to support. But they also show us that no system of control is permanent or complete. Consciousness resists manipulation. Truth emerges despite suppression efforts. And human beings possess an innate capacity for awakening that no institution can permanently suppress. The question isn't whether we can break free from these systems of control. It's whether we're willing to accept the responsibility that comes with cognitive freedom. Because once we understand how our consciousness has been shaped, we can no longer claim ignorance about our role in perpetuating or transforming the systems that govern our lives. And that recognition marks the beginning of a different kind of existence, one where we take conscious responsibility for our own thoughts, perceptions, and choices rather than allowing them to be managed by institutions whose interests may not align with our own. The Vatican's archives contain the roadmap for this transformation, preserved by people who risked everything to ensure that future generations would have access to the truth about how human consciousness is controlled and how it can be liberated. The question is whether we're ready to follow that roadmap, wherever it might lead. The deeper you dig into this rabbit hole, the more you realize we're not just talking about some ancient institution hoarding dusty documents. We're looking at the blueprint for modern information control techniques that have been refined over 2 millennia and are now being used by institutions across our entire society. Every time you scroll through social media and feel overwhelmed by conflicting information, every time you research a topic and walk away more confused than when you started, every time you find yourself accepting official explanations simply because questioning them feels too exhausting, you're experiencing the end result of systems that were perfected in the stone corridors beneath Vatican City. The Vatican's secret archives aren't just hiding the past, they're actively shaping your present. The consciousness management techniques developed by medieval church authorities are now embedded in the digital platforms you use every day, the physical spaces you inhabit, and the information streams that flow through your daily life. But here's what gives me hope. The system depends on you not knowing it exists. Once you recognize the patterns, the manufactured confusion, the artificial controversies, the selective disclosure of information, you can begin to see through them. You can start asking the questions they don't want you to ask. The information is out there. People like Dr. Marchetti and the Custodes Veritatis have risked everything to preserve it. The question is, are you ready to go looking for it? Because once you start seeing how deep this really goes, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. If this opened your eyes to something you'd never considered before, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who isn't afraid to question what they've been taught. Because the truth doesn't fear investigation, only lies do. And remember, the most dangerous prison is the one you don't know you're in